Welcome, everyone, to the new lecture series for the PEN program, the PhD in Educational Neuroscience Programs lecture series. I'm Dr. Laura Ann Petito, co-PI and Science Director for the NSF Science of Learning Center, Visual Language, Visual Learning, VL2 at Gallaudet University, and also the PEN Director's Steering Committee Chair. Today's event is sponsored by both VL2 and the PEN program itself. In addition, today represents a collaboration with the PEN 710 Pro Seminar. We begin this New Year's presentation examining neuroscience. First of all, we have to recognize that neuroscience is first and foremost a science, subject to the rigors of science. It is a sister science to cognitive neuroscience. Educational neuroscience brings us a tight focus on the learning of children, how they acquire knowledge, how, as humans, they develop given early exposure and experience. And we look at what knowledge is critical for their early entry into the schooling systems. We are also looking at the integration of knowledge of brain and behavior science, examining core content areas to see what those might be. The first of those prongs being language and bilingualism, the second, math and numeracy, the third, science and biological cognition, the next, social and emotional development, including moral development as well. We're also examining reading and literacy. In addition, the PhD in Educational Neuroscience envisions as its mission the principal translation of our findings so that there occurs a two-way communication stream between researchers and practitioners. We are delighted today to welcome Dr. Daniel Ansari. His work aligns perfectly with our goals, especially for this year, in that he is a leader in educational neuroscience and is a perfect fit to open in our lecture series this year. With a strong background in both cognition and educational neuroscience, he has a concentration in math and numeracy. You see him here with us today, but I also recall when I first met him back in 2003. He was a young doctoral student in England. He was also a graduate student at the University College in London, England. His name is one that is resounding throughout the world now, so I was delighted to ask him to come to the US and to please join our new department at Dartmouth College in Hanover, New Hampshire. We created the first undergraduate program in educational neuroscience. In fact, it was the Department of Neuroscience and Human Development. He graciously accepted and came, and for that I can never thank him enough. And right off the bat, he began to study the underpinnings to the systems of math and numeracy. He studied the development of these systems, both typical development as well as what happens when that development goes awry, when children are not learning the appropriate concepts on track for math and numeracy. His work has powerful translational impact in that it can be communicated with teachers to instruct them on best practices for mathematics and numeracy, and communicates a great deal of information about how children learn math and numeracy, both for instruction and for learning. He represents great expertise in these areas. As you will see today, he asks some of the big resounding questions in our field. How math and numeracy skills have evolved from an evolutionary perspective in humans, and whether or not we share these skills in math and numeracy with other species. He has won numerous awards. Just as a few examples, he won the Early Career Contributions in Research on Child Development Award. He won the Boyd R. McCandless Award from the American Psychological Association, and more recently, he was awarded with an award from the Mind-Brain Educational Society Award for Transforming Education Through Neuroscience. And today he holds the post as president of the Educational Neuroscience, head of the American Numerical Cognition,
head of the Numerical Cognition Lab, not American.
And I am delighted to welcome with us to us today Dr. Daniel Ansari, who is joining us today to start off our new PhD in Educational Neuroscience lecture series. And with that, I thank you and turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura Ann, for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have the opportunity to talk to you. I'm very excited to see that you are starting a doctoral program in educational neuroscience, one of the few in the nation and around the world. And so this is really sort of an innovative thing to do, I think, and there's probably a lot more programs like it to follow. And together with your Science of Learning Center, you really have a unique opportunity to explore a lot of questions, I think, around visual language and visual learning. So that I really look forward to seeing what the students in this program will do over the next few years and what results will come out of this exciting collaboration that you've started. So I want to talk a little bit about our work on the development of symbolic representations of number in the mind and in the brain. But before I sort of go into the science, I always like to remind people just how much we use numbers in our everyday lives. It's something that we don't really consciously reflect upon. So let me just illustrate this by giving you a few examples. So let's say you're going to the grocery store and you want to stay healthy and you want your family to be healthy. So you might choose to buy some apples. On a busy weekday evening, you would probably just grab a bunch of apples and you would know that's probably going to be enough to sustain us for the next couple of days. But you don't have time to really count them out. On a Saturday morning, the situation could be very different. Now you have time to count them. You can be more economical by choosing the right number of apples. So already there you're using two different ways of apprehending numbers. One is very approximate, very fast, and the other one is more exact, where you determine the exact number of items in a set that you require. I think very few of you would say that when you go shopping you use your numerical abilities, but clearly you do. Without having them, you wouldn't be able to engage in these kinds of very simple, though critically important everyday activities. So our knowledge of numbers and our abilities to both approximately and exactly use our numerical abilities guides our behavior in everyday life. This is another situation that all of us encounter. We look at the alarm clock in the morning. For most of us, when we look at these numbers in the morning, it's more likely to be a weekend than a weekday. And if it's a weekday, then you're likely going to be late for your lecture or for your job or for your appointments. So again, it's a numerical representation that directly translates into behaviors. One of them could be on the weekend to hit the snooze button. The other one could be on the weekday to be in a state of panic and to run into the shower to quickly make it out of the house. There's good reasons to believe that number abilities and being able to process numerical quantities is not uniquely human, but that we share that ability with other species. Consider this situation. It's lunchtime and you're a major predator. Let's say you're a lion and you're surveying this scene here, and you see there's a lot of tasty looking animals in this scene. Now there's different groups, different distributions of animals, and you might think about, as the predator, which group you should approach. Of course you can't have them all, so you've got to be strategic. And one of the cues you might use in this situation is the number of animals in this particular scene. Which group has more animals, and combine that with the proximity of that animals to the predator. So there's situations here where we think there's good reason to believe that number has an evolutionary history. Our ability to represent and process numerical quantities is not uniquely human, but we share it with other species. Of course, we process numbers in very complex ways. We don't just process the total number of items in a set, but we relate numbers to one another. For example, when we look at the stock market, and we need to process relationships between numbers across multiple columns, and again use that information to guide our decision making. And as you all know, this can lead to catastrophic consequences, not just for the individual that is making the decision based on the number, but for the people who, for example, their pensions are tied to those kinds of decision making. So again, one situation where we see the critical importance of our ability to process numbers quickly, efficiently, and how much they guide our decision making in everyday lives. Here's another example, the weather. We look at that all the time. Sadly, at this time of year, we're on the slippery slope towards winter, so our attention will probably be increasingly focused on numerical information representing the weather, and that guides our decision making, how we dress, how much time we leave to get to work, if there's a snowstorm, and all that. Numbers play a critical role in that. We don't necessarily reflect upon that. And then there are numbers that are just unbelievable. For example, unbelievable sports results. And they come with great emotional attachments. For me as a German, I look at this number and it immediately evokes a sense of happiness and contentment, a memory of that particular World Cup semi-final. A Brazilian individual will experience a completely opposite emotional state. So numbers play into all kinds of everyday situations in multiple ways. And so we shouldn't just think about our ability to process numbers as restricted to the formal classroom, as restricted to the educational system, but as being part of the fabric of our everyday lives, of our ability to make decisions, to experience the world around us. So if we use numbers so frequently, if they guide our decision making, they should be fairly important for all kinds of life outcomes. And that's indeed been shown. Here are just a few examples. Binner and Parson, in a report published in the United Kingdom, showed that low numeracy is associated with a greater probability of unemployment, physical illness, depression, and even incarceration. So you see all of these adverse negative life outcomes are associated with not being particularly fluent in very basic aspects of numeracy and mathematics. The OECD in Paris, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, they track educational achievement over time, and they can link the educational achievement over time to economic indicators such as the gross national product, such as the GDP. And what they've been able to show is that these two things are correlated. So improvements in mathematical competence are related to economic growth within nations. So there's a direct economic repercussion here of our mathematical competence. KPMG, the management consultancy, was tasked by the UK government to investigate the cost of low numeracy to the UK, and they estimated that it cost the UK a staggering £2.4 billion per year in lost tax revenue. Low numeracy due to not being able to fill certain positions, having to import them from other countries and so forth. So again, evidence for the dramatic economic repercussions of low numeracy. And here's a domain in which numbers influence everyday life and certain professions that perhaps we never really think about, which is a growing field called health numeracy. Until I came across it, I didn't think that numeracy would play such a big role in health. But then if you step back a little bit and think about it, it immediately becomes obvious that a nurse rushing around in an emergency room, reading off numbers of instruments, relating them to her decision making, that the ability of her to do that, of her or him, of the nurse to do that, critically depends on their ability to represent quantities, to relate them to one another, to rapidly and fluently perform rudimentary calculations that go on to influence the health of patients. So I hope this list convinces you that studying the origins of our numerical abilities and why some individuals do not grasp even the most basic concept of numbers is a worthwhile endeavor, not just from a scientific point of view, but that there are large implications for individuals and for society at large. Finally, to illustrate the importance, I just want to show this slide here. This is a paper that appeared in 2013 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, where these authors were able to show that individual differences in numerical ability predict mortgage default. That is, those individuals who have poorer numerical and mathematical skills are more likely to default on their mortgage than individuals who have relatively stronger numerical and mathematical abilities. And the surprising thing was, and that's really strengthened those conclusions, was that this relationship was independent of the individual's choice of the original mortgage package. So even if you chose a very high-risk mortgage package with a very long term, maybe with a variable rate, that even if you did that, your numerical abilities still had an influence on whether you were likely to default or not. So one very practical, everyday example, and that's critical to our existences, owning a house, is predicted by individual differences in numerical abilities. So one strategy to really better understand how individuals differ and why individuals differ in such a core competency such as numeracy is to look for the foundational competencies, to look at the factors that scaffold the development of math ability. The idea here is that foundational competencies influence the whole trajectory of learning. That if you don't have good foundations, you can't build a solid house. You can build a house, but it's always at risk of collapsing. And the best analogy here is to phonological awareness in the development of reading. Phonological awareness has been shown time and time to be a critical foundation upon which the reading brain is built. That even pre-readers, their phonological awareness, before they even learn to map sounds to print, is predictive of their later reading achievement, because you have these cumulative effects. Everything builds on these foundations, and if you don't have the foundations, you can't build subsequently more higher level systems. This graph here on the next slide illustrates this notion of these foundational competencies and the difference between having them and not having them over developmental time really well. This is the so-called Matthew effect in reading. This Matthew effect in reading was described by Keith Stanovich at the University of Toronto. And what he was able to show by summarizing all the available literature is that if you start out early in development with good phonological awareness, you're going to continue to improve in your reading skills. You're going to become somebody who has good reading comprehension, who has good processing of large paragraphs, what have you, any kind of more high-level complex measure of reading. If you don't have those foundations, you're going to continue to lag behind. So that's this notion that foundational competencies are really key. And I think in the domain of reading, a lot of progress has been made by a better understanding of these foundational competencies, which in turn has led to new ways of diagnosing difficulties with reading, such as developmental dyslexia, and has also informed the design of evidence-based remediation programs that target these foundational competencies and help children catch up before the cumulative effects of not having these foundational competencies becomes almost unstoppable. So what about foundational competencies in the domain of numeracy and mathematics? Well, one of the best tools we have as psychologists, as cognitive neuroscientists, is to look inside the infant's mind, to look inside the pre-verbal infant's mind and to ask whether there is anything in the infant's pre-verbal mind that indicates a sensitivity to numbers. So how do you go about doing that? Of course, you can't ask infants any questions. You can't give them number symbols. They haven't acquired those yet. So the strategy that researchers in the infancy field have chosen is to present infants with so-called non-symbolic representations of numerical quantity. For example, dot arrays. So what you see here is an array of 16 dots. The dots appear in various locations on the screen. And you also see that the dots have different types of sizes. So what you do is you show the infant this array of dots, you show them another array of dots, and what you do is you vary the spacing, you vary the individual sizes, but you keep the number of dots the same. So the idea is that over a repetition of 16, 16, 16, if the infant is sensitive to the rough quantity of 16, that their looking time, the time they spend concentrating on that display, will decrease. The technical term for this is the infant will become habituated to the display of 16 dots. So you do that over and over again. Here's another display of 16 dots. But eventually you change the number of items in the display. And now what you're seeing on the screen is 8 dots. So now there's been a change from 16 to 8. And what the researcher is interested in is whether the infant who has become bored, habituated to looking at 16 dots, now looks longer at this changed number of dots, the 8 dots. And it turns out that this is true. Infants as young as 6 months of age can discriminate between 8 and 16 dots. This was shown in a seminal paper by Fei Xu and Liz Spelke in 2000 and has since been replicated in a number of different labs. So very young infants seem to be sensitive to the difference between large non-symbolic numerosities, these arrays of dots. However, they can't discriminate between all kinds of numerosities because in the same paper, and again this has been replicated, Xu and Spelke showed that another group of 6-month-old infants was unable to discriminate between 8 and 12 dots. So what seems to matter to the ability of infants to do this discrimination is how different these numbers are, or what their numerical difference or distance is. So 8 versus 16, the numerical distance is 8, and 8 versus 12, the numerical distance is 4. One can also look at this in terms of their ratio. There's a larger ratio between 8 versus 16 than there is between 8 versus 12. That is, if you divide 8 by 16, there's a larger ratio than if you divide 8 by 12. Now, this signature of distance or ratio turns out to be really important in our field for describing how people process numbers, non-symbolic representation of numbers. As you will see, also animals show this ratio-dependent number discrimination or distance-dependent number discrimination. Another way of looking at foundational competencies is, of course, to ask the question whether they have a long evolutionary history, whether other species, non-human primates, show similar types of abilities as pre-verbal infants and as later young children. There's a long line of literature on how animals process numbers. dating back to the pioneering work of Otto Köhler with pigeons. I can't review all of that literature, but I want to show you one elegant example of how you can go about testing whether animals have a sense of numerical quantity. This is research by Jessica Cantlin and Elizabeth Brannan, and what they did is they trained monkeys on a touch screen to discriminate between, again, non-symbolic displays of numbers. So for example, as you can see in this display, the dots. So the monkeys learned how to first press the smaller number and then press the larger number of dots. And the monkeys get pretty good at this. They get some rewards. They get a squirt of fruit juice or water for good performance. So they engage in this activity. And after you've trained them, you can measure their ability to discriminate. And what Cantlin and Brannan were able to show was that, again, the animal's performance, just like the infant's performance, is influenced by the distance or difference between the two numbers. What that means is, as you can see from this graph here, is that the animals were significantly slower at deciding which of two dot arrays is larger, the closer they were, the more similar they were. So for example, if you showed them an array of 8 and 9 dots, they would be slower than discriminating between an array of 4 and 8 dots. That's what you can see by these lines showing this decrease in reaction time, whereby they're slowest when the numerical difference is small and they're fastest when the numerical difference is relatively large. In humans, we see the same thing. So when you sit somebody down on a computer screen, you give them a computerized task in which they have to decide which of two numbers is numerically larger, or which of two arrays of dots or squares is numerically larger. You also see that they're fastest when there's a large difference between the two numbers or the two dot arrays. And they're slowest when the two numbers or two dot arrays are closest. The same is true for their ratio. In fact, ratio and distance are highly correlated. What you can see here is that when the ratio is relatively large, adults are significantly slower than when the ratio is relatively small. One good way of thinking about that is if you are asked to discriminate on the one hand 1 versus 2, and on the other hand 8 versus 9, the numerical distance in both cases, 1 versus 2 and 8 versus 9, is 1. But their ratio differs. So ratio gives you an additional level of explanation in these studies. So what does that all mean? What does it mean that there is this effect of numerical distance on discrimination and the effect of ratio on discrimination in young infants, in non-human primates, and in human adults, as well as in human children? Well, some have argued that the numerical distance effect and the ratio effect is indicative of an underlying representation that is approximate. So you have an approximate representation of numbers. The most simple way to think about this is that you could imagine that numbers are distributed along some kind of mental number line. And along this mental number line, each number has a particular distribution. It's almost like a Gaussian tuning function. So when you see three dots, you activate that position on the number line. But the thing is, it's not a discrete representation, because when you see 3, you also slightly activate the representation for 1, and also slightly the representation for 4 and 5. So it's an analog tuning, it's not a discrete tuning. And of course, as this slide shows, what happens then is that numbers that are close together, you see the below example of 5 and 6, share more overlap than numbers that are far apart, such as 3 and 9. And that might then explain why it's harder to discriminate between 5 and 6 than it is between 3 and 9. So this approximate number system has become a very dominant approach in our field to explain the kinds of effects that we see, such as the distance and the ratio effects. And indeed, very powerful evidence in support of the approximate number system theory and the notion that there exists this distance and ratio dependent tuning is work with single cell neurophysiology, where now you're literally measuring activity of single nerve cells in the brain whilst an animal is performing a number discrimination task. In this case, animals had to discriminate between dot arrays. And Nieder and Miller, in a seminal paper in Science magazine, were able to show that both in the prefrontal as well as in the parietal cortex, there exist neurons that fire most vigorously for a particular number of dots. So this neuron here is a number 4 neuron. As you will be able to see from the slide, this neuron fires most vigorously when the monkey is presented with 4 dots. But you can immediately see that this neuron is not indifferent to other numbers. It also fires slightly less to 3, even less to 5, and much less to 1. So again, the further the quantity that the monkey is seeing is from the preferred numerosity, which is 4, the lower the firing rate, consistent with the distance and the ratio effect, and this notion of overlapping tuning functions. So a neuron that primarily fires when you see 4 dots also fires when you see 3 dots, but doesn't really care so much about 1 dot. So it's this distance-related tuning. We also understand something about the neuronal systems in the human brain. There's lots of work, and I'll show you more of that. I just want to show you one example of a study where Jessica Candlon and colleagues looked at the brains of 4-year-old children using functional magnetic resonance imaging. One of the first studies to look at the brains of 4-year-old children, and it looked at their ability or at the brain's response to numbers. What she used here is a paradigm, a test method, very similar to the one used with the 6-month-old infants that I showed you before. In the scanner, the children had to do nothing but look at a screen, and they would see 16 dots in different spatial arrangements. And then sometimes they would see, instead of 16 dots, they would see 32 dots, or they would see 32 squares. So in one case, the number changes, but the shape remains the same. And in one case, the shape changes, but the number remains the same. So now she could look at which brain regions are more activated by the shape and number compared to the shape and change. And what she found, she looked at this in both adults and children, is that there are areas of the brain, particularly in the parietal cortex and the intraparietal sulcus, that respond more to the number change than the shape change in both adults and children, particularly in the right hemisphere, suggesting that there might be a core system, this core approximate number system, that has a specific locus in the brain, in the parietal cortex, and that this brain system is quite similar between 4-year-old children and adults. So when we now summarize what we've learned about foundational system, I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that there exists a sensitivity to numerical magnitude in a non-symbolic format. That one way of describing that is to refer to it as the approximate number system, that it exists from infancy onwards, that we can measure it in other species, and that it has clear signatures, such as the distance effect, which is very important because that makes it comparable across these different ways of measuring it. And we know something about the brain system when we think that the parietal cortex, particularly in the right hemisphere, is critical for this system for approximate number representation from an early age onwards. But of course, for us as human beings, numbers are more than just arrays of dots or groups of apples in a shop. We have, over the course of cultural history, constructed increasingly complex symbolic representations of number. If you think about it, the Arabic numerals that we use, that are on our digital clocks, that are on your phones, that you constantly use to inform your daily lives, have become almost a universal language across the globe. We use Arabic numerals to communicate between nations about really important problems regarding economy and so forth. So one of the challenges then for us as cognitive neuroscientists, and especially as people who want to connect cognitive neuroscience with education, is to find out how we make these symbols meaningful over the course of learning and development. Because for a young child, if they see the Arabic numeral 7, it's nothing more than a meaningless shape. There's nothing about 7 that says it refers to the quantity 7. It's what we refer to as a completely non-iconic representation of number. There's nothing about this. It's a completely arbitrary representation, no relationship, and that relationship needs to be learned. So that sets up a problem for us in our field. We know a lot about these foundational systems, but we actually don't know a lot about how symbols are related to those and whether indeed they are related to those. And that is referred to as the symbol grounding problem. Stefan Harnad in 1990 wrote a very influential paper on the symbol grounding problem in language, where, to sort of summarize a very long and intricate paper, he posed the question, how do words acquire their meaning beyond the relationship between words? How are they grounded to their actual physical meanings? How does that occur? And we have the same problem in our field in the study of number. We need to ask questions such as, how do symbols acquire their meaning? And what non-symbolic representational systems are they actually connected to? And this symbol grounding problem is what I want to spend most of the rest of my talk talking about. So the symbol grounding problem, to sort of also justify why I'm going to spend time talking about it, I just want to highlight that it's important for understanding, I think, how biology and culture interact. And so we can use the study of number to study a fundamental interaction between these cultural tools of representation, symbols that we've constructed, and biological systems for the representation of quantity that we might share with other species. It's a key issue, therefore, in educational neuroscience, because one of the things that we're doing when we're educating is we're enculturating the brain. We're taking a brain that is ancient and we're teaching it to construct cultural representations that allow us to share knowledge between people. And in that way, it allows us to also study the construction of uniquely human brain systems for number symbol representations that we do not share with other species. And by doing so, it allows us to understand the development of symbolic abilities and also, importantly, the origins of math difficulties. So do some children who struggle with math, do they also have problems perhaps in making that connection between symbols and quantities by solving the symbol grounding problem, if you like, on their own developmental trajectory? And that in turn then leads to targets for diagnosis and remediation. So there's lots of proposals out there in the literature for how we should solve the symbol grounding problem. Here is perhaps the most dominant proposal by Stanislas Dehaene, articulated in various articles. I've just picked one here from 2007 that I think very elegantly summarizes that position. And he argues that the non-symbolic representation of numerosity, that is numerical quantity, is universally present in infants and adults of all cultures. I've just shown you the evidence for that, and precedes the acquisition of linguistic symbols for numbers. We can already measure it in infants and pre-verbal infants. So when we learn number symbols, we simply attach their arbitrary shapes to the relevant non-symbolic quantity representation. So the argument is that we solve the symbol grounding problem simply by mapping symbols to this pre-existing approximate number system. Here's another very similar proposal by Manuela Piazza, who argues that humans are born with strong intuitions on approximate numerical quantities and their relations. There is evidence to suggest that culture-based acquisition is grounded on these pre-existing intuitions. So symbols acquire their meaning by being connected to the approximate number system. These theoretical statements are very important because they set up predictions that are actually testable empirically. But it's actually surprising to see that despite the importance of this problem, the symbol grounding problem, there's been much more theory, such as I've just shown you, and actually surprisingly little empirical testing. The hypothesis for how to solve the symbol grounding problem sets up a number of testable predictions, as I've just said. One of them is, if number symbols are grounded, mapped onto the non-symbolic approximate system, then we should see that the efficiency of non-symbolic processing should correlate with symbolic math. Let me unpack that a bit more. The notion here is that individual differences in how well non-symbolic numerical magnitudes are represented, if they indeed provide the foundations, if you have a sharper, more refined non-symbolic number discrimination system, that should facilitate that mapping process, the attachment of the symbols to that pre-existing representation. And in turn, related to that, non-symbolic representation should be impaired in developmental dyscalculia. If non-symbolic representations of quantity provide the basis for our symbolic number abilities, which in turn help us to learn how to calculate and do all sorts of complex mathematical things, then this representational basis should be impaired in children who go on to experience great difficulties in acquiring symbolic number skills. So we and others have asked this question, whether individual differences in these foundational competencies matter, whether indeed there is a correlation between non-symbolic number discrimination and individual differences in math. I'm just going to show you one example from a relatively recent study that my former graduate student, Nadia Nosworthy, who's now an assistant professor at Andrews University in Michigan, conducted for her PhD. What she did is she went back to basics and just designed a very simple paper and pencil test where children were given booklets, and in these booklets they saw either pairs of dots or pairs of symbolic numbers. And they simply had to cross out the numerically larger number of dots or the numerically larger Arabic digits as quickly and as accurately as they could. They were given 56 items per condition, and it was timed because we were, of course, interested in variability. So some children may get very far in the test, others may not. Does that matter in terms of their math ability? And in that context, critically, we also tested their math fluency and math calculation skills using a standardized measure, the Woodcock-Johnson test of educational achievement. So the question that Nadia asked is, does this 2-minute magnitude processing test correlate with math achievement? And in her first study, she studied a large group of children from 1st to 3rd grade. And the results of that analysis did indeed suggest that if you just take the mean scores collapsed across symbolic and non-symbolic, you do find that there's a significant correlation. That is, individual children who do better on this test of symbolic and non-symbolic magnitude discrimination are also those children who perform relatively better on the standardized test of math achievement. In follow-up analysis, however, Nadia increasingly came to the conclusion that it was the symbolic version of the test that really made a difference, that really explained individual differences in math achievement. So whilst both symbolic and non-symbolic version of the test correlated, that is the dot version and the digit version, it was only the symbolic version of the test that accounted for unique variance in arithmetic. So when you looked at the joint variance, it was only symbolic that accounted for unique variance. And it did so over and above other factors that are clearly important for number and math learning, such as working memory, intelligence, and reading abilities. That is not to say that these measures are not important, but this test, the symbolic version of the test, accounted for additional individual differences in arithmetic achievement. So from this, we could conclude that the processing of number symbols is critical, and that non-symbolic number discrimination does not perhaps play as much of a critical role as the symbol grounding problem would predict. So perhaps it is then that the deficits in symbolic number abilities arise not from a pre-existing impairment, an innate impairment of the approximate number system, but rather in deficits in making that connection between the non-symbolic and the symbolic system, in grounding symbols in their meanings, in attaching non-symbolic representations to the cultural symbolic representations. Of course, correlation does not imply causation, so one of the things that Nadia did was to examine whether this test also predicted performance over time, and additionally to that, related to the symbol grounding problem, whether one version of the test, either the symbolic or the non-symbolic, was better at predicting performance over time. What she did is she tested 268 children in senior kindergarten on a paper and pencil test. This was run in collaboration with the Toronto District School Board. And the school board permitted us access to the grade 1 grades. So what we could do now was to say, okay, your performance in senior kindergarten, does it predict how well you do as rated by your teacher in grade 1. And what we found was that individual differences, particularly in the symbolic version of the test, correlated with their grades in number sense, measurement, geometry, and data management in grade 1. Non-symbolic, the correlations weren't as consistent and much lower. So again, suggesting that it's the symbolic version of the test that counts and not so much the non-symbolic version of the test. I just want to briefly digress and sort of draw your attention to the fact that we have created a website that makes this test publicly available and makes our existing norms, our standardized norms, also available. So you can go to this website, you can download the test, you can administer it, you can enter the data back into the website and get a norm. These are based on children in Ontario, but they should generalize to the United States, and we hope to, of course, extend this website to include norms from many different countries. It's a very usable tool. One of the reasons why we decided to go back to basics and go back to paper and pencil was that we wanted to find a test that could be used in all sorts of educational contexts, including low-income countries. So here you see this test being a pilot study that we ran in outdoor schools in rural India, where you can see it's very easy to import this tool. And I think that's one of the goals as well of educational neuroscience, is to derive predictions from cognitive neuroscience, but then to implement them in education in a way that could be universally applicable. This might be one very small step towards achieving that goal. So you might ask, well, this is one study with one test. Is there really any consensus in the literature regarding this question? And to be honest, the answer is no. There are many studies that suggest that non-symbolic correlates with individual differences in achievement, that it predicts individual differences in achievement. But there's equally many other studies that suggest once you account for symbolic skills, that's not the case. So this still remains to be resolved. We've tried to go one step towards the resolution by conducting a large-scale study. One of the things that we notice when we summarize the literature is that there's a large variation across studies in the sample size, the age of the children tested, and those factors, those variable factors that vary across the different studies, those could account for the variation in the results we see. Maybe it's specific to one age group. Maybe non-symbolic predicts early and then symbolic takes over. Or maybe it's only at a certain sample size that you start to see these subtle relationships emerging. We therefore perceive that there's really a need for a large-scale investigation. We were fortunate to collaborate with a group at the University of Maastricht led by the late Leo Blomert, and we were able to test a group of nearly 1,500 children in schools throughout the Netherlands. They came from grades 1 to 6, so we made sure we had a large age coverage. There were between 175 and 225 children per grade. And we were able to test both children with and without specific learning difficulties in the domain of arithmetic, developmental dyscalculia. So these children were children that were specifically impaired on their ability to perform on a standardized test of arithmetic, but they were within the normal range on tests of reading and IQ. Developmental dyscalculia is a specific learning difficulty in arithmetic, just like dyslexia is a specific learning difficulty in the domain of acquiring reading skills. So we collected a lot of data from these participants, and I don't want to go on and on about this, but I want to show you, related to this symbol grounding problem, the results from a symbolic and non-symbolic number comparison paradigm. This time it's computerized, and the participants have to choose which of two digits or which of two dot arrays is numerically larger. And what we found was the following. What you see in this graph is, in the red bars, you see the performance. This is reaction time, how fast you are. So the higher the bar, the slower you are. That you see that in the red bars is the typically developing children, abbreviated as TD. And in the yellow bars is the children with developmental dyscalculia, abbreviated as DD. The take-home message is that across all 6 grades, grades are indicated along the top, across all 6 grades, children with developmental dyscalculia are slower on this symbolic version of the test than their typically developing controls. So symbolic really discriminates between children with and without developmental dyscalculia. When we looked at the results from the non-symbolic version of the test, this was not the case. There were no consistent differences. There was a significant difference in grade 1 and in grade 5, but in all other grades the differences were non-significant. So consistent with Nadia's data and also consistent with a lot of other data in the field, we could not find very strong evidence for this notion that an impairment in non-symbolic number representation drives difficulties in learning even the most basic symbolic skills, which is essentially developmental dyscalculia. So I just want to provide an interim summary and then move on to some more neuroscience-based studies. So contrary to the simple mapping hypothesis or the symbol grounding problem or the theories that have been offered to resolve the symbol grounding problem, we see that non-symbolically does not consistently predict symbolic math. I think it's really important here to emphasize consistently because, as I said, there's still a mixed body of data out there that still requires more empirical investigation. Non-symbolic number discrimination skills do not represent a strong marker of developmental dyscalculia. We therefore think that symbolic number development and grounding symbols to their quantity representations is more complex. Perhaps we need to think about a separate system for number symbols, or perhaps we need to return to the idea that was already articulated quite a while ago by Susan Carey, that number symbols are grounded in a system for small number enumeration, that you attach the number symbols to arrays of 1 to 3 items, but beyond that, it's, the number sequence is simply bootstrapped from the rules that you have learned from making that connection to the small number range. We're in the process of collecting some data relevant to this question, but I don't have time to go into detail on that data yet, but if you want to ask me more about that in the Q&A session, we certainly can. But what I want to sort of do in the next little while is to ask the question, I've talked mainly about behavioral data, is whether cognitive neuroscience can constrain the symbol grounding problem, because we are here talking in a seminar series on educational neuroscience. So is there any value added by using neuroscience method to constrain this fundamental question that has theoretical as well as educational repercussions? So early on, I showed you some data by Jessica Cantillon that suggested that in the 4-year-old brain, there is sensitivity to numerical quantities, numerical magnitude in the parietal cortex, and that you see activation in the parietal cortex in 4-year-old children that looks quite similar to the activation in adults. Now, this work has been extended and taken forward to even younger children, and Veronique Izard and Daniel Hyde and others have shown very similar results using different methods, such as near-infrared spectroscopy, which also Dr. Petito uses right here to study language representations in the brain. This method has been used to show that you see activations in the right parietal cortex in very young infants as well. So it seems to be that the right IPS is responsive to non-symbolic representations of number from infancy onwards. When we look for symbolic number in the brain, what we see is a shift in the hemisphere. So here are just 2 examples of studies where people have used refined methodologies to look at which brain regions are engaged when adults process number symbols, such as digits, Arabic numerals. And here you see activation in the left hemisphere. So perhaps what is going on is that over developmental time, over the course of learning and education, there's an increasing specialization of the left hemisphere for the symbolic representation of number, and an increasing segregation of this non-symbolic system on the right and the symbolic system on the left. This hypothesis can be tested, of course, by asking whether there is indeed developmental specialization for number symbols. My former graduate student Stefan Vogel tested this question by examining 20 children aged between 6 and 14 years of age. He used functional magnetic resonance imaging to look inside their brains while they processed numerical symbols. And the question he wanted to ask is there a correlation between age and activation? Now, to give you an idea of how this works, here's what the experiment looks like. It's a method called fMRI adaptation. It's very similar to the logic behind the experiments with babies, but now you're doing it with older children and adults. So in the scanner, and I have to admit this is a very boring task, what you see is you lie in the scanner and you simply see numbers on the screen. In this case, what we're doing is we're repeating the number 6 over and over again. The reason why we're doing that is that fMRI adaptation predicts that the brain region that is important for representing number symbols will decrease as you repeat a particular number. So the brain region that cares about 6 will decrease in activation, will adapt or will habituate as you repeat that number. But what then happens is you show a different number and you expect a recovery in the response. So this slide here sort of shows that. You can see that if you go 6, 6, 6, and you look at the brain response, your prediction is that it will decrease. And then you will get this sort of rebound effect when you now show 8. Now that's been demonstrated in adults that this works very well. Stefan's study applied this to children, and what he was able to ask then was, first of all, do any brain regions respond to number symbols across the age range, sort of age-invariant representations of number symbols? And here what he saw was that there was indeed a response to these deviants. So, for example, a response to the 8 after repeating 6, 6, 6, 6, 6, or a response to 10 after again repeating the 6s in the right hemisphere, specifically in the right intraparietal sulcus. However, when he looked at the correlation between age and response to the change in numbers, he saw activation in the left hemisphere. So what this correlation shows then is that older children showed relatively larger responses to the change in number following the adaptation to 6 than younger children. In other words, the left parietal cortex becomes increasingly engaged in the representation of number symbols, consistent with this hypothesis that there is a specialization of perhaps a number symbol system in the brain that is different from the system that is involved in the non-symbolic representation of numerical quantity. That the number symbol system is perhaps early on grounded or tied to a non-symbolic system, be it, for example, the small number system, but over developmental time becomes a representational system in and of itself. So we see that the left hemisphere responses to number symbols develop, that there might be a right to left shift that still needs to be investigated. The construction, I would hypothesize, of a symbol-specific system, an NSS, if you like, a number symbol system, for lack of a better term. What this would predict then is also that the degree of specialization for symbolic number in the left hemisphere should be correlated with individual differences in symbolic math achievement. My graduate student Stephanie Bugden, who's just writing up her PhD thesis at this very moment, for her master's thesis, investigated this question by looking at 17 children between the ages of 7 and 9 years of age. Outside of the scanner, outside of the fMRI scanner, she measured their math and reading abilities, and inside of the scanner they performed the task that you're already familiar with now, the symbolic number comparison task. So judging which of two numbers is larger, just pressing a button underneath the side of the larger of the two numbers. By doing so, Stephanie could now ask, when children have to discriminate symbolic numbers, which brain regions are activated, first of all? And then secondly, are those brain regions, do they differ between the individuals as a function of their mathematical abilities? In other words, do individuals who have a more mature representation of symbolic number, are those also the children who have better math skills? So what Stephanie found was that, first of all, this symbolic number discrimination activated the left parietal cortex, consistent with the notion that the left parietal cortex is really important for symbolic number processing. She also found that it exhibited a ratio effect, so symbolic numbers that had a relatively large numerical ratio, such as 8 and 9, activated this brain region more than numbers that had a relatively small numerical ratio, such as 1 and 9. But most importantly, what Stephanie found was that individual differences in the amount of activation of this brain region were correlated with math fluency scores. So how much this brain region responded to symbolic number, the brain region that we know is important for number symbol processing, that increases in its activation to number symbols over developmental time, the amount of that brain specialization is correlated with individual differences in school-relevant math achievement. And critically, there was no correlation with reading. So this was not just a correlation between brain activation and how intelligent or how able children are, but it was a correlation specific to their mathematical achievement. So we see that the left hemisphere responses to number develop, and we also see that the degree of left specialization is related to individual differences in arithmetic achievement. The final thing I would sort of want to touch upon is an area of research that I think is neglected sometimes and will become increasingly more important in cognitive neuroscience and in educational neuroscience to constraint question, is to ask about the consistency of our findings, because we're generating a lot of data, especially with functional magnetic resonance imaging. There's been an exponential growth in the number of investigations using this method, which is terrific. But we need to conduct analyses to look for consistent patterns across different studies using different paradigms, different stimuli in different laboratories using different strength of the magnet and so forth, to really see whether what is the signal and what is the noise, what can we generalize across studies. And we became worried about these laterality differences because fMRI is a relative measure. If you get more activation in one hemisphere, that doesn't mean the other hemisphere isn't engaged. It just means that at that statistical threshold, you get more activation in that hemisphere. So we thought that one way of sort of challenging this notion of these laterality differences for symbolic and non-symbolic, which in turn have critical theoretical implications for our understanding of the symbol grounding problem, was to conduct a quantitative meta-analysis. For this, in order to really look at which brain regions are most consistently involved across studies, we used this Ginger ALE tool. ALE stands here for activation likelihood estimation. It's a methodology used in meta-analytic studies of neuroimaging data. This is work by my second-year master's student, Mariah Sokolowski, who spent the whole summer inputting these data into this program and then conducting the meta-analysis. And what she's done so far is to look at 8 papers that 8 symbolic minus control, that is a control condition, that doesn't involve symbolic number comparison, but controls for low-level features such as pressing a button and the overall visual stimulation, and 7 non-symbolic minus control papers. In total, she then had 15 different papers with 25 neuroimaging contrast and 186 foci. So the question is now, when you pool all of this data together, do you still see these laterality differences? So here's what she found, and I should emphasize this is preliminary, unpublished data. This is still ongoing. There will be more data that we'll put into it, but the initial results look fairly compelling. So this is when we look at, across all of these studies, which brain regions are activated in both the symbolic and the non-symbolic. And we see bilateral activation, consistent with a lot of activation, a lot of other studies. But then if we ask, across all of these studies, which brain regions are consistently more activated during symbolic number processing than non-symbolic number processing, we see activation in the left interparietal sulcus. And in contrast, when we look at the overlap, we see that this brain region is actually unique from the brain region that shows the conjunction of symbolic and non-symbolic, consistent with this notion that there's this emergence of a number symbol system, or at least a left hemispheric system that isn't completely overlapping with non-symbolic representations of number. So I want to summarize and conclude and then leave some time for questions. I think we've come a long way in the field of studying numbers and addressing some of these fundamental questions related to the origins of number, which hopefully, in the spirit of educational neuroscience, will lead us to solving problems and to preventing some of these adverse effects of low numeracy that I showed you at the very beginning. But we're still faced with this symbol grounding problem, and I think it's important for theoretical reasons as well as practical ones. The dominant hypothesis in our field is that symbols acquire their meaning by being mapped onto a pre-existing approximate system for the representation of number. I think the evidence I've demonstrated to you today is at the very least inconsistent with that. At both the behavioral and the symbolic representations are different. And I think it's time that we have new theoretical accounts and that we consider that symbols clearly. I think it's time that we have new theoretical accounts and that we consider that symbols clearly need to be grounded, but they may not be grounded in the approximate number system, and we may have the development of an increasingly independent numerical symbol system over developmental time, and that development in turn facilitates educational achievement. So I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Laura Ann, for the kind invitation. I'd like to thank most of all the students and collaborators who worked with me on these projects, and of course the various funding agencies that generously supported our research. So thank you very much. And of course, happy to take any questions.
Will the camera get me here? Okay. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I think I saw a paradigm shift here, really. The idea of this mapping may not be, that the mapping may not be what we've always thought of as somewhat counterintuitive. Because we're used to this idea of reading, for example, having these abstract symbols in this printed language having to be mapped onto this phonological representation. And the idea that math symbols are written symbols as well, shouldn't that also be mapped onto a similar system? But the idea that we may be developing a separate numeracy system for these mathematical symbols is, well, really the question came to me at the end of your presentation, where does this NSS then come from? If we so often say that, you know, humans are evolving and our brain systems have evolved for print and for symbols, where then does it come from?
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That still remains largely unresolved. My hunch is that Susan Carey and Mathieu Lecouré and others are right in that symbols initially, because symbols need to be grounded. There cannot be a system in which symbols are not grounded and not connected to quantities. But that we have several representational systems for quantity, and that the initial grounding is to small sets of numbers that can be so-called what we refer to as subitized. So when I show you an array of 2 dots, an array of 3 dots, subitized. When I show you an array of 2 dots or 3 dots, you can immediately say there's 2, immediately say there's 3, but once it goes above that, you have to count. And that aspect of our visual system allows us to initially make the one-to-one correspondence between symbols and quantity, and that from that we learn something about the structure of the number-symbol system, the one-to-one correspondence, the successor function, and so forth. And we then generalize that to larger numbers. But those larger numbers need not be connected intimately to the quantities that they represent. Just think about it. You have probably never seen 1,000,000 dots. Yet you can reason about 1,000,000. You know that there's a difference if I showed you 1,000,000 written out and then 1,000,000 and 1. You would know that they are different. But if I showed you 1,000,000 dots and 1,000,000 and 1 dots, you couldn't discriminate them. Probably. I don't want to sort of say that you couldn't. Maybe you could. But it would at the very least be very difficult. So the symbol system, that's also the wonderful thing through the place value system and so forth, the way the symbol system is set up, it allows us to reason about numbers that we have never encountered before, and allows us to make fine discriminations that we couldn't make on the basis of the approximate number system alone. The other reason why I think maybe Susan Carey was right is that small numbers, the representation of small numbers is so discrete, and symbolic number representations are exact. The approximate number system, by its very definition is approximate. So the grounding needed to be in some sort of exact representation of number. But we need more direct investigations in order to further our understanding.
Wonderful. Great presentation. Thank you. A wonderful presentation. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it. And I particularly enjoyed it because of my own work with language and literacy. Written language is a representative system that externalizes this understanding outside of the body. The symbol that is understood in the brain is represented externally here in this written language. It allows us to do things with language in more ways than we might if we could only use our language in internal and communicative events, by signing or speaking to each other. It's so ephemeral there. The externalization of these symbols onto paper are so important to that. So we are using language and symbol systems externalized onto this medium so that we can do more with language. Mm-hmm. And so in your own discussion here of numeracy and the symbol systems versus the non-symbolic representation, that really strikes me as having some connection here, in the comparison of non-symbolic and symbolic. So what then is gained by this externalization of numeracy on paper? I think if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah.
And the linkage, the lack of connection between
a non-symbolic and a symbolic representation is really quite important because it involves putting numbers onto paper in a symbolic way, which allows us then to do more with numbers than if we were constrained by the non-symbolic representation of quantity. Yeah. So it's not exactly a question, more of a comment perhaps about the importance of having a symbolic representational system.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, if mathematics, a lot of mathematics rests on our cultural invention of the symbolic system.
Sorry, say it again.
A large proportion of mathematics rests on having this symbolic system, and of course then extending it even further in algebra and so forth, and increasing the referential relationships between symbols and quantities. So I agree with you. It's a fundamental extension that the human mind has been able to construct over cultural history. And if we only represented numbers approximately, we wouldn't have buildings, we wouldn't have, all these artifacts that humans have constructed over the course of their own cultural history.
Also consider that in our brains, without these symbols to work with, how then we create symbols for the expression. We have symbols to express something that is in spoken form or a signed form, but then having the symbol be representable on paper and externalized, does that help give and attribute more meaning to the symbols that we have in our heads because they're able to be externalized that way? If it is not on paper, non-symbolic,
I guess the temporal.
How are we navigating that? If it's purely mental, then being able to do it in an external form rather than it being solely an internal mental process.
Yeah. I mean, just speculatively, of course, it increases the temporal longevity of that symbolic representation by having it on paper. But you know, one of the interesting things is also writing and number symbol writing. There's been a lot more research on writing in language than there's been on number writing. And one of the things that I want to do is it's very difficult to do, but I really want to launch a research line on children's writing of number symbols and how that influences their brain representations. It's not just, maybe it's not just learning to write, but that process changes the symbolic representations in some ways as well in their minds. But I'm just speculating about this because of some beautiful work in reading where people have shown that learning to write the letters really changes their brain representations, even at the phonological level.
So the symbol there on the paper becomes an externalization, an extension of the mental representations
Yeah,
of the symbols
absolutely.
we have.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So am I understanding developmental dyslexia? Individuals with developmental dyslexia often have problems in math and possibly dyscalculia. And I'm wondering whether so it said that they have good visual spatial representations and can work with shapes and all these kinds of things. I'm wondering if whether you might think that they have their problem may be a fundamental symbol grounding problem rather than specific to linguistic or numerical information.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and you're absolutely right. There's a lot of what we refer to as comorbidity between dyslexia and dyscalculia, and an intuitive theory would be, you've got to map sounds to letters, you've got to map symbols to magnitudes. It must be in the mapping process. But it turns out that most of the research on trying to find any kind of overlap or any kind of common cause of dyslexia and dyscalculia has been largely unsuccessful. That doesn't mean that there isn't one, but for example, that symbol, the idea that it's all about the symbol mapping, referent mapping thing hasn't turned out to be correct. And so it remains to be seen whether it's sort of whether there's some other hidden variable that we haven't yet uncovered that explains the very vulnerability to developing these specific learning difficulties in the two domains, and then sort of having them coexist in the same mind-brain, but not necessarily having arisen from the same common cause. But as I say, there's a lot more research to be done on that. Certainly, one of the appealing things from a neuroscience perspective is that the angular gyrus is important in phonological processing. It's also important in manipulation of numerical symbols. So, the common brain region may suggest a common underlying deficit, but it hasn't turned out to be the case. But then again, we haven't, for Michelle Mazzocco at the University of Minnesota and Dan Birch in 2007, I hope I said that right now, estimated that for every 14 papers on dyslexia, there's one on dyscalculia. So we're still so behind in our understanding. Our understanding of the whole disorder is so impoverished that I think there's a lot more to come, and including the comorbidity with dyslexia.
Hello there. Regarding your last comment, that actually leads to my question. I'm wondering where research on dyscalculia is going next.
I think I think research on dyscalculia is really, in my view, where it needs to go are two dimensions. One of them is we need to find better operational definitions of dyscalculia by not just, because one of the things is we'd say dyscalculia is, you're bad at math, and then we diagnose it if children are bad at math, but we need to find something lower level, whether it be at the brain level or at the behavioral level, and we need to go earlier. We need to look at response to intervention as well. Lynn Fuchs at Vanderbilt is doing a lot of that type of work, and I think that's really important because we'll get a better idea, those children who are non-responders, what characterizes them, what are their deficits, and that will then directly lead to hopefully better remediation approaches. And we need to, and the DSM-5, which has only recently been published, actually mandates this for all the specific learning disorders. We need to look at children who have a deficit demonstrated at least twice, at least 6 months apart, because I think in the dyscalculia literature, and I've made that mistake myself, so I'm not sort of criticizing others, but including myself, is to test children once to select the ones that show a profile of dyscalculia, call them dyscalculic, and then do all sorts of follow-up studies. Stephanie Buckton, whose work I talked about earlier, has collected lots of data from groups of children who show stable deficits and unstable deficits. And of course, they're very, very different from one another. So we need to look at that as well.
That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture. Stimulating. I have so many thoughts. One of the things, your findings, what really struck me is the puzzle, from a brain perspective, the very puzzling, strongly sequential hypotheses about the simple grounding theory. That first there would be this early non-symbolic capacity, and then sequentially later would develop the symbolic capacity. And that reminded me of, in language acquisition, the strongly sequential theories that had first children develop gestures and then later symbolic capacity. And when all is said and done, after decades of research, it's really the children do not produce symbolic gestures unless they first have the word in their active comprehension and production vocabulary. So I was wondering about, with regard to math here, what is the reverse relationship? How does the symbol knowledge impact the non-symbolic system? It must. We shape it, sculpt it, impact it.
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's a great one, and the short answer is it does. And there's actually evidence now that the direction goes more from symbolic to non-symbolic than from non-symbolic to symbolic, consistent with the notion that maybe these systems initially developed independently, but the symbolic system shapes the non-symbolic system. And yes, exactly. Yeah.
One more question.
Yeah.
And it reminds me of Dr. Hersig's research. Okay, so Dr. Hersig worked with Susan Golden-Meadow and Carol Paddon, and they did this, the studies that in which a child who was at a mathematical juncture in development where they couldn't go the next stage to do the computation had this intermediate step of producing gestures, and then once they produced this gesture, the child could then solve the math problem. So it's a fascinating finding, and I'm trying to reconcile it. Is it a mapping success that the child's achieving? Is it a crosstalk between symbolic? Might you have thought about what's going on with those findings? They're from behavioral data.
Yeah.
That, the mismatch. When a child is literally mismatching the gesture and the word, that's when they're at the ready state to learn the mathematical concept. And it's a teaching moment.
Yeah. Now, I'm familiar with the work on gestures and math, and I find it fascinating. Also from a neuroscience perspective, because the parietal cortex is, of course, critically important for the translation of vision into action, and gesture is just that in some sense. So, but exactly how that relates to the symbol grounding problem, I'm not sure. Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for taking the time to present with us to us today, and we have also noted a number of different analogies to our own field of deaf education here, and with that of educating deaf children to be skilled users of American Sign Language, finding parallels and linkages between that and their later literacy skills, and looking at teacher presentation of content in American Sign Language, and then the distribution of pen and paper tests that are testing that knowledge in a completely different mode and means. And they're certainly not going to pass the test given that it's done in English when all the instruction and content was in ASL. And so we have to bridge those modalities there, the instruction in ASL, and then the symbolic and non-symbolic, I think, gives us a good sort of intuitive grasp on this numeracy, but we have to see also how this leads to modeling and skilled modeling of knowledge of the range of 3 being greater than 1, but the range being different than that of 10 to 8, for example. So this bodes well for giving teachers tools for bridging the non-symbolic for the and the symbolic, and not just for teacher modeling, but teacher modeling of this numbers and the greater range, but meaning of those numbers. So I see a great deal of parallel here between your research on numeracy and our findings in language, and the translation to educators. So with that, I just want to give you an opportunity also to have any closing remarks that you'd like to share with us before we take you over to the reception. Anything perhaps about future directions of your work, and then we can also people can approach you there at the reception for further discussion as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you again
Thank
so
you.
much for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, that concludes our presentation today.